Good day, duelists! Welcome to the final installment of the top 10 cards of each civilization series. In this chapter, we're tackling multicolored / rainbow cards. As a reminder, we're rating these cards on competitive viability, so how often these cards see play in competitive decks, how good said decks are, and how much do these cards make you want to play said decks. What's interesting about this list is that since rainbow cards were only released in the last 3 sets of the TCG, there are overall way fewer of these cards than the classic boring mono-civ counterparts, so there is a much smaller pool of cards to choose from. In fact, if I'm honest, I could not find 10 cards that see consistent play in mainstream top tier decks, so the power level at the low end of the list might be slightly lower than one might otherwise expect. If we take consistency out of the equation though, there are many multicolored cards that pop up here and there every so often in some rogue strategies, and honestly any of them could fill up the number 10 spot and are worthy of at least an honorable mention. However, in the end, the card I decided to put at number 10 is none other than Starnoid, Avatar of Hope. Now, Starnoid has had a very interesting history. Way back when, in the olden days of Duel Masters, in the era of aggro and mid-range decks, Starnoid's ability to generate shields was king, and Starnoid-based decks were very strong as a consequence. However, as the game progressed, not only did Skysword plus Soul Swap shenanigans become the preferred way of generating shields, since it requires less resources, has an easier setup and also ramps you up in mana in the process, but also the rise of heavier and heavier control decks slowly pushed Starnoid into obscurity, since going -3 in card advantage to a single terror pit is just an instant loss against such decks. That said, Starnoid decks still pop up here and there and can perform decently, especially in aggro-filled environments, and unlike some other cards I've mentioned previously, at least this one is the centerpiece of its own deck, which would otherwise not exist. For this reason, why Starnoid just barely makes the list at number 10. Moving on to number 9, we have Tajimal, Vizier of Aqua. As far as vanilla blockers are concerned, Tajimal is probably the strongest one out there. 3 mana for 4000 power is already par for the course in terms of power ratio, but it jumps all the way to 8000 when battling fire creatures, and guess what? Most decks that would be slowed down by blockers include fire, as that is one of the top civilizations when it comes to aggression. The problem with Tajimal is, well, it's the problem with blockers in general. You would most times prefer to play something more proactive. It's almost always better to remove a threat than playing a blocker, since A, removal is permanent while the blocker is temporary, but also B, removal is guaranteed whereas a blocker needs to survive in order to achieve its goal, which can be difficult against certain decks. However, Tajimal is very good against a certain format warping creature, the Duel Masters All-Star Bombazar Dragon of Destiny. Since Bombazar is a fire creature, Tajimal stops it right in its tracks with its massive 8000 power. It's also cheap at just 3 mana, which is relevant considering that Bombazar decks can sometimes outright kill you on turn 4, but also removal is hard to play against Bombazar since you don't get a turn once it hits the board. As such, Tajimal becomes unsurprisingly one of the best defensive options. The thing is, Bombazar is banned in pretty much all English formats, including IDC, International Duel Masters Cup, arguably the most competitive Duel Masters environment out there. So if you're playing Duel Masters nowadays, it's likely you won't see much of Tajimal since you won't see much of Bombazar. But if we're talking about English Duel Masters in general with no restrictions, then no doubt in my mind Tajimal well deserves a spot in this list. At number 8, we have one of my personal favorite Duel Masters cards, Miraculous Meltdown. What this spell does, to summarize the many words on it, is it equalizes shields. So if you are at 0 shields when you cast it, your opponent is all of a sudden at 0 shields as well. And if you have a creature on board that can attack, congratulations, you've just won. As long as your opponent doesn't have any shield triggers, but we'll get to that later. I can't think of another card in Duel Masters that can end duels by itself the way Miraculous Meltdown can, and it's always spectacular and memorable when a duel ends this way. That said, Meltdown is definitely not without its issues. Alright, let's get the meme deck out of the way first. Dedicated combo deck which stalls until 12 mana, then plays Ghastly Drain into Miraculous Meltdown to wipe out all shields, and after Meltdown resolves and all potential triggers have been played, summons Pyrofighter Magnus for one final attack. I call this a meme deck because, well, not only are there many ways to play around it, most notably blockers or just killing them before they get to their combo, but also if you've managed to gather 12 fucking mana, there's 100 different more consistent ways to win at that point. Instead, where Miraculous Meltdown finds its competitive home is normal control decks, which throw it in as a one-off silver bullet that will sometimes win a game or two against aggro. And I'm putting emphasis on sometimes because the stars kind of need to align for you to win with it. You need to A. have your Meltdown in hand, B. you have to play against a fast deck, C. you survive until turn 6 against said fast deck, D. you have creatures on board to attack with, and E. your opponent does not have enough shield triggers to stop said creatures. In short, a lot of things need to go right. Also, your control deck still needs to include enough small creatures to make full use of Meltdown, which is to say, this card is quite restrictive. But even then, it does see occasional play in decks like Forbos Control or Rob Control, which is why I think it's deserving of the number 8 spot. I didn't even talk about the psychological aspect of this card. See, sometimes the threat is greater than the execution. If your opponent knows you have Meltdown, maybe they hold off on breaking that final shield, which might just buy you that extra precious turn you need to survive. Anyway, I've rambled about this card enough, let's just move on to the next one. Number 7. Melania the Aqua Shadow. We're getting into the realm of cards that see consistent play in well-performing decklists. Melania is a very cheap, efficient creature that slots in perfectly into Water Darkness aggro. 2 mana for an unblockable creature is already not that bad by itself, but add to that its Snare ability, which lets it both remove big threats and make sure it can be traded into without sacrifice, and you've got yourself a card. But the cherry that pushes Melania over the top is the fact that it's a liquid people, which has arguably the best evolution creatures in English Duel Masters, including Crystal Spinslicer and Crystal Paladin. The only reason why it's not higher than number 7, well, it's Water and Darkness, and these two civilizations are not generally known for their aggression, in fact, quite the opposite, so the number of decks that it goes into is quite limited. In fact, in terms of competitive play, it's pretty much exactly this Water Dark aggro list and not much else. At number 6 we have Miraculous Snare, by far and away the most efficient removal spell in Duel Masters. You use it on one of your opponent's creatures and just like that it's gone basically forever. It's even better than destroying it because it cannot be retrieved from the graveyard by cards like Corpse Charger or Morbid Medicine. Yes, you're giving your opponent an extra shield, but if you're a control deck, you don't really care. Think about it, Terror Pit is one of the most played cards in Duel Masters, and that one has cost 6. Miraculous Snare costs half. Okay, that's not really a fair comparison, we should look at the non-shield trigger version Hopeless Vortex, but still, Snare is 2 mana less than that. You can also use it on your own creatures, for example, when your opponent's board is empty as a safeguard against speed attackers. Bonus point if you target a shield trigger creature with it, such as Aqua Surfer. There's also loops you can do, for example, you can put your Faliga into your shields, and then when that shield gets broken, you play said Faliga, fetch Snare, play it once again, add it to shields, etc, etc. Ruby Deckout absolutely loves this card, since the whole identity of that deck is removal into removal into removal, not to mention that deck never breaks shields, so it doesn't care about that quote-unquote downside. People say Deckout can't exist without slash cards, well, I would almost argue that it can't exist without Miraculous Snare either, or at the very least it single-handedly elevates the deck by a couple of tiers. On a personal level, I used to absolutely love Miraculous Snare. I would play it into anything I could. Fortress Burn, 4 snares. Hydro Hurricane, 4 snares. Azonia's decks, believe it or not, snares. And it is by playing with this card so much that I came to learn of its shortcomings. First of all, okay, I don't know what I was smoking when I put into Azonia's an aggressive deck that wants to break shields, not make them. Yeah, Miraculous Snare is a control-only card, and honestly the main problem with it is, through no fault of its own, deck slots and control decks are just very competitive. You need your win conditions, you need your cards that get you to your win conditions, and so you're left with only a limited amount of deck space you can allocate to removal. And for those slots, generally you want some triggers like Terror Pit so you can stand your ground against aggro, you want spells that remove more than just one thing like Apocalypse Vise or Miraculous Plague, maybe you want something more versatile like Spiral Gate, and at the end of the day, it ends up being a bit difficult to slot in Miraculous Snare, which is surprising given how strong it is. All in all, middle of the list at number 6 seems like a pretty good fit for it. Moving on to number 5, Miraculous Rebirth, and what a card this is. you destroy something with 5000 or less power, which, side note, in competitive Duel Masters, I can pretty much count on one hand the number of relevant creatures that have more than 5000. And then you yourself get to summon a creature with the same cost. And this is just absolutely bonkers. Worst case scenario, against some rush deck, you destroy a random 2-drop and summon yourself a Belix from the deck, and you've just relieved some board pressure and you got yourself a blocker to protect you, which in itself is not bad, though not amazing either. But it quickly ramps up from there. For anything other than the fastest of decks, a lot of relevant cards are occupying the 5 mana slot. Mistria, Skysword, Faliga, and the list goes on. You'll very often have a 5-cost creature to hit, which is convenient because A, that's right around the time where a 6 mana spell becomes playable, but also B, you are getting one of your relevant creatures, like you can summon your own Mistrias to start your draw engine, or how about summoning a Faliga and taking back the Rebirth you just used so you have it available for next turn. And it only gets better the higher up you go. How about destroying a Fortress Shell and summoning one from your deck, getting more than 9 mana worth of value for this 6 mana spell. It's even sometimes used in fast decks to remove a blocker while simultaneously bringing out a speed attacker or a finisher like Magma Dragon Jagalzor. The list of use cases goes on, and overall it's just a very solid card, and it's starting to see more and more play nowadays in the competitive scene. Maybe time will prove that this card deserves to be even higher, but for now I think number 5 is where it belongs, solely because I think there are 4 cards that deserve a higher spot just a little bit more. Speaking of which, number 4, Miraculous Plague. In my opinion, one of the coolest looking cards. This 7 mana spell targets 2 creatures and your opponent chooses one to destroy and one to return to hand, and then does the same to the mana zone. It gets a grand total of 4 cards off the board just by itself, which, I mean, first of all, that's a mass removal spell outside of the Fire Civilization, which some decks desperately need, but also putting your opponent 2 mana behind can be game winning by itself. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. Fortress Control absolutely loves this card. The plan of the deck is to hold off incoming creatures while ramping up to burn your opponent's mana, and guess what? Miraculous Plague does both. It fits like a glove in that deck, and honestly I don't think the deck would exist without it, or at the very least not in this color combination. But even outside of Fortress Burn, it sees play in most other slow decks that make use of these civilizations, for example Hydro Hurricane, or even in some but not all variations of Ruby Deckout. I don't think there's much else that needs to be said about Miraculous Plague, and this video is long enough already, so let's just move on to number 3, Skysword the Savage Vizier. This card was underrated for the longest of times, but nowadays there is almost no successful control deck that doesn't run the Skyswap package. I mean, the general game plan of control decks is stall the game out until you have enough mana to play your big things, and Skyswap does both, and it does both really well. And yes, it's impossible to mention Skysword without talking about Soul Swap, because yes, getting a shield and ramping yourself up for 5 mana is pretty good, but doing that for 3 mana is what really pushes it over the edge. Anyway, back in the olden days, the preferred method of defense against aggro was simply blockers, as it was probably meant to be when the game was designed, but why would you block an attack, assuming the blocker doesn't die in the first place, when you can instead nullify the attack by generating an extra shield, which also A, gives you an extra card in hand, and B, gives you an extra shot at a shield trigger, which can very quickly turn the duel around. And of course, it helps that a lot of power plays in Duel Masters cost 7 mana, think Apocalypse Vice, Lost Soul, Miraculous Plague that we just talked about, which means that if you play Skysword on curve, it perfectly sets you up to use these game-turning spells on the following turn. The main reason why I decided to put Skysword only at number 3, despite being such a meta staple, is because Skysword is enabled by the existence of Soul Swap, while the other top 2 cards are just busted on their own. Which leads right into number 2, Gonta the Warrior Savage. 2 mana for 4000 power, that's all there is to it. But boy is this card way over the power level curve. I think what happened with Gonta was that it was released in DM10, the first set in which multicolored cards were printed, and I think they were still trying to figure out just how to balance them, and with Gonta they just missed the mark on the balance scale. Later on in DM12, I think they realized their mistake and they released a bunch of 3 mana 4000 power creatures which are honestly quite well balanced and even played in certain decks. They took Gonta, increased its cost by 50% and ended up with some well balanced cards, so you can imagine where Gonta itself sits on that scale. It's a shame because they could have so easily made it a 3000 power attacker plus 1000, and it would have been both closer to the expected power level for a 2-drop, more interesting, and more flavorful for the nature and fire civilizations. The thing is, despite all of that, Gonta does not break the game. At the end of the day, it's just a vanilla. I mean, the power level is there and it is played in pretty much every single aggro or mid-range deck that includes Fire and Nature, and it is pretty much the best thing you can be doing on turn 2 in those decks. But at the same time, it's not a card that will win the game on its own, and it is something that you can eventually deal with. The same thing cannot be said about our number 1 spot, which of course is none other than the forbidden one, Bombazar, Dragon of Destiny. Now, as I've mentioned before when talking about Tajimal, Bombazar is banned from pretty much every format, so you won't really see it played all that much, but when it is legal in a tournament, it just warps the whole format around itself. You either play Bombazar or you play a deck designed specifically to counter Bombazar, and that's pretty much it. So what's the big deal with Bombazar anyway? Well, when he enters the battle zone, you get one extra turn, with a small caveat that you lose the game at the end of that turn. So you get a grand total of 2 turns to end the game, and of course you're only playing Bombazar when you are confident you can win during this time, so the downside is many times irrelevant. Now here's my own hot take right here on Mr. Bazat's channel. This effect by itself is actually kind of fine, and it's, all things considered, pretty fun. In Japan they later printed this exact effect on a spell card and it was perfectly fine. The problem and the reason why Bombazar is so busted is not the effect per se, it's that it's printed on a fucking speed attacking double breaker. So over the 2 turns you get, Bombazar by itself breaks 4 shields. This means that all you need by the time you play Bombazar is just one tiny creature to end the game, because Bombazar enters, breaks 2 shield, Tiny Creatures breaks 1, extra turn, Bombazar breaks another 2, and then Tiny Creature can end it. Of course there's also shield triggers and blockers that might require you to have more, but this play pattern is just so ridiculously bonkers. It's funny because in the original Japanese release there were a whole bunch of overtuned cards like Aquan, Astra Reef, Skeleton Vice, and the great part about the English version, which is part of the reason why I like it so much, is that they could look at those cards, notice how disruptive they were, and port over nerfed versions, which is how we got Marinomancer, Brain Serum, Cranium Clamp, etc. But for some reason, they decided to leave this card alone, I'm guessing because it later becomes a staple of Shobuki Rifuda, the anime's protagonist, and so they didn't want to change it for marketing purposes maybe? Alas, I guess we will never know for sure. All we know is that we did get the original unaltered Bombazar, and it is undoubtedly the number 1 strongest multi-civ card and probably the strongest card in English Duel Masters in general. And that's it. The top 10 multi-civ cards. To recap, we have Bombazar, Gonta, Skysword, Miraculous Plague, Miraculous Rebirth, Miraculous Snare, Melania the Aqua Shadow, Miraculous Meltdown, Tajimal Vizier of Aqua, and last but not least, Wise Starnoid, Avatar of Hope. Do you agree with my picks? Do you disagree? Have I missed anything? Let me know in the comments down below. For now, that's all, duelists. See you next time, and until then, take care.